Everything began yesterday morning when I glanced out of my kitchen window and noticed three individuals meandering through my backyard. They carried measuring tapes and clipboards, and at first I assumed they might be utility inspectors, especially since we had recently had some work done, but their furtive glances toward my house made me suspicious. For context, my partner Carla and I bought our home about 6 months ago. It's a charming property with roughly 1.2 acres of land, backing up to a modern development that is governed by an HOA, although our home is not part of that association. We deliberately chose this property because it offered ample land and the freedom of not having to abide by restrictive HOA rules. The previous owner had lived here for 30 years before moving closer to family. I stepped outside to investigate the unusual activity and was soon confronted by a man who introduced himself as Derek, the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. He wore an unnaturally forced smile and clutched a bright yellow legal pad densely filled with numbers. "Good morning. We're conducting a routine survey of community properties," he explained in a tone that implied his actions were entirely ordinary. I responded calmly, explaining that our home was not part of Maple Ridge. His smile tightened as he replied, "There seems to be some confusion. According to our records, this section of land falls under our easement rights, and we're planning some community improvements that require access to this area." I was caught off guard, but I stood my ground and mentioned that our property documents clearly affirm our full ownership, a fact we confirmed at the time of purchase. Derek then adopted a condescending tone, insisting that a previous agreement with the former owner granted the HOA certain rights and promising that official documentation would be sent our way. Before the conversation could progress further, my neighbor Marcus, who has lived here for 15 years and is one of the few residents outside the HOA, approached me privately. He warned, "Watch out for them. They tried this tactic on the previous owner, and they've been trying to expand their jurisdiction for years, always claiming some archaic easement agreement that just doesn't hold water." Before we continue with the story, I want to ask for a favor. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and it's my absolute dream to once reach this. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. On to the story. I spent the rest of yesterday meticulously reviewing our closing documents and property records. Sure enough, there was absolutely no mention of any HOA easement rights. Our property lines were clearly defined, and our ownership was unequivocal. I even discovered notes left by the previous owner documenting issues with the HOA's attempts to assert authority over the land. Then, this morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. The letter, adorned with official-looking letterhead and filled with legal jargon, demanded that we comply with community standards and reiterated their claim of pre-existing rights to access and modify our land. It even threatened appropriate action if we didn't cooperate. A bold and unsettling move that felt like an attempt to seize part of our property through bureaucratic maneuvering. Carla was understandably incensed and insisted on installing security cameras immediately. Marcus explained that since Derek assumed the presidency last year, the HOA's tactics had grown increasingly aggressive, and that our case was not isolated. Later that afternoon, I encountered Ethan, a board member whose demeanor suggested he was uneasy about the unfolding events. In a hushed tone, he confided that not everyone on the board supported Derek's aggressive approach, and he hinted that Fiona, Derek's wife, was pushing for a community beautification project that conveniently required access to our land. Determined to document everything, I began taking photos of our property boundaries and called a friend knowledgeable in property law to help draft a formal response. I also arranged for additional security cameras to be installed over the weekend. As I spoke with more neighbors, I learned that the HOA had a long history of attempting to extend its control over non-member properties. An elderly neighbor, Martha, recounted that the association had been trying to absorb non-HOA properties for years by invoking dubious easement rights or by coercing residents into compliance. I promised to keep everyone informed, though it already felt like this confrontation was just the beginning. We had bought this house specifically to avoid such HOA drama, And now here we were. A summary of the earlier events is in order. Derek and his team were first observed measuring our non-HOA property and claiming easement rights, then sending us a threatening letter. But the situation escalated further. Yesterday morning, we received a bulky envelope containing what appeared to be official documents. Although the papers boasted elaborate letterhead and stamps, something felt off. Included was a notice of community integration, whatever that might mean. An invoice for $3,200 in alleged past-due HOA fees, and a demand to remove our newly installed security cameras on the basis that they violated community standards. Even more bizarre were altered property documents that showed different boundary lines, accompanied by what the HOA claimed was an original agreement from 1992, stipulating that our property was intended to be part of the association, even though our house wasn't built until 1994. When I pointed this glaring error out to Derek via email, he quickly backtracked, explaining that it was merely a preliminary planning document. The tension continued to mount. This morning, Ethan came by again, looking anxious and constantly glancing over his shoulder while we talked on my front porch. He revealed that there was a deep divide within the board over this entire issue. According to him, Fiona was the primary force behind the project, having pushed for the community expansion for months. The absurdity reached its peak when he disclosed that the HOA was planning to build a community pool, and the rear portion of our lot was the perfect location due to its elevation and space. Taking Ethan's advice, I visited the county records website and discovered that the HOA had attempted similar tactics with 3 other properties over the past 2 years. In fact, they had even been cited twice for unauthorized construction outside their boundaries. It was also striking to learn that Fiona and Derek had only moved to the area 3 years ago. While I was delving into these records, Carla noticed something peculiar on our neighborhood Facebook group. Fiona, who managed the page, had posted vague remarks about problem properties, allegedly lowering home values, and even shared a photo of our house taken from the street, hinting that residents should be wary of those installing security cameras. Marcus continued to be a steadfast ally, showing me letters that the HOA had sent him last year with similarly dubious claims. He also introduced me to Martha, who has lived here for 40 years, and she was unequivocal in her criticism, calling Derek and Fiona's tactics the worst thing to have hit the neighborhood since the 1987 tornado. The community itself was split. While some HOA members privately apologized to us, others fully embraced Derek and Fiona's narrative. I even overheard 2 women remarking that it was unfortunate we were hindering community progress. I have been keeping a detailed timeline of events, and the security cameras have already proven their worth. They captured Fiona strolling along our property line, snapping photos. When she noticed the cameras, she waved in an overly dramatic manner that sent chills down my spine. Later this morning, another certified letter arrived. This one bizarrely claimed that by installing security cameras, we had signaled our intent to join the community and were thus subject to HOA guidelines, a stretch of logic that was hard to fathom. Then, Derek posted a notice about an emergency HOA meeting to discuss security concerns and property line disputes, scheduled for next week. I immediately contacted a property lawyer to review all the documents, and they couldn't help but laugh at the shoddiness of the HOA's paperwork. Despite the absurdity, it was nerve-wracking to know that these people were actively trying to take over our property through bureaucratic means. My anger was still simmering as I recounted these events. Although I had mentioned an emergency meeting earlier, things escalated before that meeting could even take place. This morning, I was awakened by the sound of machinery in my backyard. Peering out the window, I saw 3 men setting up stakes and spray painting lines on my lawn, and a small excavator was parked at the edge of my property. Derek was there alongside Fiona, who was busy filming the entire scene on her phone with a smug expression. I quickly got dressed and rushed outside, demanding, "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Derek, maintaining an unnervingly calm demeanor, replied, "Good morning. We're simply beginning the community improvement project that you were notified about." I retorted sharply, "You were told multiple times that this is not HOA property. Get off my land immediately." Fiona, still filming, stated that if we continued to be hostile, they would have to take further action. The contractors, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, asked to see the permits. Derek insisted that they were being processed. Realizing the gravity of the situation, I immediately called the non-emergency police line while Carla documented everything on video. It was at that moment that Ethan arrived and began arguing with Derek right there on my front porch, insisting that the board had never approved such an action. Derek's face grew red with anger. Marcus joined us for support, and Martha could be seen from her porch, already on the phone with other neighbors. Within minutes, several community members had gathered, and the police arrived, Officer Alexander taking charge. He quickly confirmed that the property was indeed ours, that the HOA had no permits or easement rights, and that the contractors were not properly licensed. On hearing this, the contractors immediately packed up their equipment, with one muttering, "We don't need this liability." Meanwhile, Fiona continued to film and narrate, claiming that we were being uncooperative, even though the video clearly showed our side of the story. In the midst of this chaos, Samuel, the surveyor we had hired to mark our official boundaries, arrived with all the necessary documentation. Officer Alexander directed everyone from the HOA to leave while Samuel worked. Despite Derek's attempts to argue that permits were pending and that they held provisional authority, Officer Alexander made it clear that if they returned without proper documentation, they would be charged with trespassing. Later that afternoon, our security cameras captured Fiona walking along the street, talking to neighbors and gesturing at our house. She then posted on the community Facebook page, falsely claiming that we had physically threatened her group and destroyed community property by interfering with their stakes. Shortly afterward, Ethan returned to apologize, explaining that he had resigned from the board in protest of the events. He revealed that Derek had never secured proper board approval for his actions, and that several board members were now considering legal action against him. He also confirmed that the community pool project had been rejected months ago, and that Derek and Fiona had misled contractors by claiming that permits were in process. I have since compiled extensive evidence, photos of the stakes and boundary markings, security camera footage, police incident reports, contractor statements, updated property surveys, and numerous witness accounts. The private Facebook group of the HOA is in utter chaos, with screenshots showing members calling for Derek's removal, while others defend him. Fiona has even been deleting dissenting comments. Marcus texted me later to report that Derek was calling for yet another emergency HOA meeting that very evening at his house, with several HOA members promising updates. Based on police advice, we plan to file for a restraining order first thing tomorrow, while also meeting with legal counsel about our options. The situation reached a climax yesterday. Although we had already secured a restraining order against Derek and Fiona, prohibiting them from coming within 100 feet of our property, we were not done yet. One morning, while I was enjoying coffee on our back porch, I heard the rumble of engines. 3 pickup trucks pulled up to the edge of our property. Derek jumped out of the first truck, flanked by 4 unfamiliar men. Fiona was in the second truck, phone at the ready, and the third truck carried construction materials. Derek began shouting about reclaiming what belonged to the community as he strode onto our property. I immediately started recording on my phone and called the police once again, while Carla activated our security camera's live recording feature. The confrontation unfolded quickly. I demanded that they cease their activities, warning, "You're violating the restraining order. The police are on their way." Derek, red-faced and agitated, declared, "This ends today. We're taking back what belongs to the community." One of his associates began unloading fence posts, and another carried a post hole digger, clearly intending to fence off part of our land. Marcus sprinted over, soon joined by Ethan and 3 other neighbors. Martha reappeared on her porch, this time armed with her garden hose. Despite our warnings, Derek's crew pressed on. When one of them shoved Marcus as he tried to block their progress, tensions exploded. I stepped between them, arms raised, and ordered, "Back off our property right now!" Derek tried to push past me to set up the fence posts and ended up grabbing my shirt. Although I'm not one for physical confrontation, I held my ground. In the ensuing struggle, Derek lost his balance and fell backward, looking rather foolish. Fiona began screaming about assault, conveniently neglecting to film the fact that it was Derek who initiated the contact, while one of her crew swung at Marcus. Marcus dodged the blow, and the assailant himself lost his footing. At that moment, the police arrived with perfect timing. 3 units, including Officer Alexander, who had been involved earlier. They quickly determined that Derek and his crew were trespassing in clear violation of the restraining order, based on multiple witnesses and security footage. Fiona's phone was confiscated as evidence, later revealing footage of Derek allegedly planning the entire operation earlier that morning. Derek was taken in for violating the restraining order, and 2 members of his crew were arrested on assault charges after Marcus pressed charges. Fiona received a citation for trespassing, despite her continued outbursts about community rights. Simultaneously, an emergency HOA board meeting was convened, and Ethan later messaged me with the results. Derek and Fiona had been removed from the board, and the HOA formally acknowledged that our property was entirely independent of their association. They are now facing fines from the city for multiple violations, and several board members are pursuing legal action against them personally. In the aftermath, we learned from neighbors that Derek and Fiona are now in the process of selling their house, and the HOA is restructuring its board. The community is organizing a meeting to ensure such overreach never happens again, and we plan to install permanent boundary markers next week. The HOA's new leadership, with Ethan serving as interim president, has already issued a formal apology and admitted that our property remains completely separate from their association. Reflecting on all that has transpired, I still cannot believe they thought their tactics would work. Our security camera footage has been requested as evidence, and the HOA is now updating its bylaws to prevent future overreach. We are even installing an iron fence along our property line as an additional safeguard. The support from neighbors, whether they belong to the HOA or not, has been overwhelmingly positive, and although these events have been incredibly stressful, I am proud that we stood our ground and addressed the situation through proper legal channels.